Argument analysis begins by identifying the parts of an argument in order to be able to evaluate the merits of the whole argument. So as we've already seen in part 1 of the course, the main components of an argument are the following. So there's the main contention or conclusion, the claim that the argument as a whole is intended to justify or support. Then there's the assumptions or premises, the claims that are presented as common starting points for the person making the argument and his or her audience. And then, of course, there are inferences, and these are the moves that connect the assumptions or premises, the starting points, to the conclusion. They're the moves in the argument. So much of the study of logic at the introductory level involves learning how to evaluate these moves or inferences that we find in arguments. So later in the course, we'll begin to study, the nature of inference as we learn, how to evaluate the form of an argument. But the first challenge for any practical application of the kind of formal skills we're going to learn, the first challenge involves learning how to identify the conclusions, premises, and inferences of the arguments as we find them in ordinary experience or in ordinary conversational settings. And this is way more difficult than it might appear at first. And the source of the difficulty is the diverse and multi-level and highly contextual character of human conversation. So clear, well-written arguments of the kind you'll find in good legal writing or in philosophical writing aren't what you're going to encounter in the media, in commercial life, or in conversations with your friends and family. So in order then to reason carefully about the diverse range of informal arguments we encounter, the first thing we have to do is adopt a generous attitude. So just because an argument isn't presented in the style of a legal brief or isn't written like an academic article, doesn't mean that we can dismiss the argument. So we're interested in the pursuit of truth, really, and we should be open to the truth coming in unexpected packaging. So the first step then is to approach important arguments assuming that our conversational partner or the author of the text is actually making an argument, that they have reasons for their view, and that they've arrived at the view in a rational manner. Now, this charitable assumption might be wrong, we might be incorrect, but in important matters, it's going to be worth the risk of being too charitable. So it's necessary to learn how to listen and read carefully in order to be in a position to even identify the parts of our interlocutor argument. So our goal at this stage then is to locate the logically relevant parts of an argument. So in particular, what we're going to find is that the main contention is hard to find in these murky contexts. So we're going to need to evaluate the relevance of the sentences, of each of the sentences we find in an argument. And we're going to realize that in most pieces, in blog posts or conversations or editorials, most of what's written is irrelevant to the argument. So our first task then is to distinguish irrelevant rhetoric or fluff from the real structure of an argument. So to start with, as we approach the argument, we're going to learn to ask 3 questions. So the first is, keep in mind, we're going to ask, what's the point? What's being assumed? And how does the argument move from the assumptions to the main contention? So how is the work of this argument, getting done? So as we know, the conclusion is what the speaker is attempting to convince his or her audience to accept. So when we're looking for the main contention, we're looking to understand the overall point of a written or spoken argument. So in many informal contexts, as we've said earlier, a speaker or an author might not be clear about his or her conclusion, or might be arguing for multiple or even mutually incompatible conclusions. So when we're not being careful with our talk and our writing, it's easy to lose track of what it is we're arguing for. So we'll be sensitive to that as we attempt to apply these formal techniques. And, there might not be a point to some particular line of argument or discussion. Not everything, as we've seen, also is an argument. It's also possible that someone appears to be making an argument, but has no conclusion, or there's no conclusion to be found. So as you read or listen to an argument, it's usually worth assuming that maybe there is a conclusion, even if the conclusion isn't explicitly stated in the text. So as I said previously, this is going to require us to become charitable readers and listeners. So we'll discuss the role of charity in the interpretation of arguments in this part of our course. And in a nutshell, really what we're about here, what we're saying is that if our focus is getting at the truth rather than simply wanting to win arguments, it's incumbent on us to give the strongest possible reading to our interlocutor's arguments. Right? So in more formal contexts, there are these telltale markers that are going to indicate the presence of the logically relevant parts of the argument. So for example, in the case of a conclusion, we'd have words and terms like therefore, hence, because of this, accordingly, this, thus, and so on. I'll argue that, my thesis is, and so on. So the presence of words or phrases like these indicates that the author means to mark some kind of conclusion. But even here, we can't do it mechanically, right? So many of these words will appear repeatedly in a single text or conversation, in part because there might be sub-arguments or sub-conclusions that support the main contention of the argument. So we've looked a little at this when we studied argument mapping in part 1 of the course. So as we've already seen, it might be the case that in order for our interlocutor to establish his or her main contention, and the author will make a number of sub-arguments along the way of the argument, or the sort of overall contention. So these sub-arguments then establish claims that in turn are intended to support the main contention. So as we're looking for the main contention, then it's important to note that it can appear anywhere in the course of an argument. It doesn't necessarily appear at the beginning or the end of a text or a conversation. So it's important then to avoid prematurely judging an author's or a speaker's main contention. So our project is different from the project of the rhetorician or the advertising executive or the politician. We're not in a contest. We're not interested in persuading people or in defeating our opponents in an argument. Our task, just to repeat, is to get the clearest possible picture of the way things are in order to make the best decisions that we can. So we're in the business of the pursuit of truth and inquiry when we engage in our argument analysis in this part of the course. So thanks.